We're going to finish up talking about a few other cycles that were discussed in your book. And the next cycle we want to talk about is the oxygen cycle. Now, obviously, for our own survival, the oxygen cycle is extremely important to all of us. I'm going to start over here at this point right here. It says oxygen is used by animals, plants, bacteria, fire, decomposition, and even rusting of metal in the form of oxidation. So oxygen is obviously extremely important. And most of the oxygen in the environment comes from phytoplankton, which is plant plankton in the ocean. I think it's been estimated that somewhere anywhere in the range of 50 to 60% of all the oxygen that comes or is returned to the environment comes from phytoplankton. Now, over here we have some oxygen that is also created in the atmosphere by when sunlight breaks down water. Now, sunlight is an energy source, and water can be broken down, and so it is a possible source. There's also, when lightning happens, oxygen is actually converted to ozone as well. Now, as I said here, it says here again, most of the available oxygen comes from photosynthesis, and most of that is from the phytoplankton as well as the plants on the land, but the vast majority is from phytoplankton. And then the last point I'll make from here is the fact that most oxygen stored in oxides in the earth, that is things like ferrous oxide, which is rust, etc., is not available for human or animal use. And animals use all the oxygen, so that's where the oxygen goes, is through the respiration, and then also it is lost in oxidation of various metals and substances in the environment. So that's the oxygen cycle. Now, obviously, if oxygen is important and algae produce oxygen, that makes algae important. As you see here, it says that the production of oxygen is a byproduct of photosynthesis. And all aerobic, that is water or oxygen loving or air loving organisms, require oxygen. So all of the various fungi and animals need oxygen in order to live. So the autotrophic organisms, those organisms that do photosynthesis, are responsible for producing the oxygen, and that's why this plankton here that looks so nasty is so important. If something were to happen in the ocean that would destroy the plankton and the algae in the water, then we would be extreme risk of losing the oxygen in our environment. Now here's the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is the cycle of carbon through the environment. And you see that animals that eat plants, the plants contain carbon. The animals, when they use oxygen, they give off carbon dioxide, and this carbon dioxide goes into the environment. Also, when you burn something, the byproduct of combustion is carbon dioxide. So combustion is a source of carbon dioxide, and respiration is a source of carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide is used by plants as part of the photosynthetic process. Another source of carbon dioxide is decomposition. When animals decompose, part of that decomposition produces carbon dioxide. So again, the plants are primarily responsible for using carbon dioxide, and these various other sources are responsible for producing carbon dioxide. Now that leads to a problem that some people have talked about called global warming. Now, global warming, what they're talking about here is that a certain amount of energy comes to the earth through the sun, and this energy is partially absorbed by the ground, but much of it is reflected, and then it is reflected, it's radiated back into space. Now there's a layer in the atmosphere here that blocks some of this. It blocks it coming in and it blocks it going out. But it's thought that these so-called greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide being one of them, blocks the exit of the radiation back out into space, and this causes more radiation to stay than is normally required or is thought to be normal. And this, by some regard, is thought to cause an increase in temperature, or so-called global warming. And here's just an example of what we're talking about. This is temperature measurement back in 1900, and you can see that this is sort of the 0 point. They've just arbitrarily selected that. And let's say that this area here, or even in this area, is sort of the starting point. So if the temperatures were less than that, they were recorded this way. And they're greater than that, they're recorded this way. And what you can see is that up until about 1990, most of the temperatures were less or below that. But then after 1990, you start seeing a rise. Now, one side of this, as I'll point out, is the rise over the last 20 or so years has only been about 1 degree, according to this situation. But it's thought that if this trend continues, that would become a problem. Now, there are several problems, but the most important problem with this is the accuracy of these global temperature measurements. How does one go about measuring temperature globally? And it's very difficult to do that. And so many people who have questioned the idea of global warming, when they look at this evidence, they say that these temperature readings are not accurate. So, as I said, the greenhouse effect is a process where these gases, primarily carbon dioxide, but also water, vapor, and methane, they trap heat that would otherwise have escaped into the atmosphere. So when I talk about the greenhouse, when you hear the word greenhouse effect on the television or wherever, that's what they're talking about, is these gases accumulating. And the big concern in the United States is the internal combustion engine. Remember, combustion was one of the ways in which carbon dioxide is produced, and it's thought that these large numbers of automobiles and other engines have added significantly to this greenhouse effect. The last cycle we're going to talk about is the nitrogen cycle. And the nitrogen cycle is the movement of nitrogen through the environment. Now, nitrogen exists in the atmosphere primarily as nitrogen gas, or N2. It can also exist as oxides of nitrogen, such as NO2 here. And this nitrogen, if you remember, amino acids have nitrogen in them. And so proteins have nitrogen. So for animals to make protein, they have to have a source of nitrogen. So nitrogen has to constantly be moving through the environment. And the way that this is done is through the process of nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation takes nitrogen gas out of the atmosphere and converts that into biologically active molecules. It also converts it into nitrates and nitrites, which are shown here, which are consumed by plants and converted into protein, as well as into ammonia, which is consumed and converted into protein. So all of these are important for the animal to take in, and they all end up in the plants that these animals that are primary consumers eat. When the animals eat the primary consumers, they can make protein from the nitrogen in that plant, and then when they're eaten by secondary and tertiary consumers, the nitrogen is passed on. And so this process of converting nitrogen from the air into usable nitrogen compounds to end up in the plant is extremely important. Now, bacteria that fix nitrogen are called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So remember, nitrogen fixation is the conversion of nitrogen gas into biologically active molecules. Bacteria are frequently the primary organisms that fix nitrogen. And their metabolic processes are such that they can take nitrogen gas out of the air and convert it into ammonia, nitrates, and biologically active molecules. Now, bacteria that can take ammonia and convert it into either a nitrate or a nitrite is called a nitrifying bacteria. So the primary production by these bacteria is ammonia. And then on top of that, other bacteria have to convert that ammonia into the nitrites and the nitrates. And that you see that fertilizer is primarily ammonia. So it's primarily ammonia and nitrates. And so that feeds directly into the plants, and this all contributes to the production of protein in the consumers. Now, on the other side of the nitrogen cycle is denitrification. There are bacteria, here's bacteria that convert complex molecules with nitrogen in them back into nitrogen gas. So whatever nitrogen is not used can be converted back into gas and sent back into the atmosphere. And here you see fertilizer, the nitrates enter the groundwater. They are acted on by bacteria, and these bacteria then produce primarily nitrogen gas, but also dinitrogen oxide. And this is another way in which nitrogen is taken out of the environment and how the cycle goes on. Now, what is a potential problem? Well, there's something called nitrogen pollution. And nitrogen pollution is using too much nitrogen in the environment, in the form of agricultural fertilizer, in the form of sewage, from various decomposition of animals, and also from waste products from animals and so forth. And so here it shows where this nitrogen goes. It goes into the water supply, and it goes into various other areas, agriculture and so forth. And it ends up impacting human health, ecosystems, and climate. And you can see that the principal material that causes problems is ammonia, which is in fertilizer, as well as nitrates that are released into the air. So I'm going to stop here and end this week's lecture. Next week we will begin talking about invertebrates, which are animal organisms that do not have a backbone.